August 18, 1945, Changi Prison, Singapore. The woman who would later be identified only as Subject 127 in British military records stood against the concrete wall with her eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for what she'd been trained to expect. She was 23 years old, Korean by birth, Japanese by forced citizenship, and something without a proper name by occupation. Around her, 37 other women stood in similar postures of resignation, some Japanese, most Korean, a few Chinese and Filipina. They had been discovered 3 days after the Japanese surrender in a commandeered hotel that military records euphemistically called a comfort station. Now they awaited processing by British forces, and every woman in that room knew what processing meant. Interrogation through violation. The conqueror's ancient right repackaged as intelligence gathering. Subject 127's hands trembled as she heard British boots approaching. But when Captain James Hartford entered with 2 female nurses and a translator, he did something that shattered every expectation built by 3 years of systematic brutality. He stopped 3 meters away, kept his hands visibly at his sides, and spoke in a voice so carefully gentle it sounded like a foreign language. "You're safe now. No one here will harm you. I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman." Context: the machinery of comfort and the architecture of trauma. The comfort women system was one of the Japanese Imperial Army's most systematic crimes, though it would take decades for the full scope to be acknowledged. Between 1932 and 1945, an estimated 200,000 women, the exact number remains disputed, were coerced, deceived, or forcibly recruited into sexual slavery for Japanese military personnel. The system operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Women were transported like military supplies, housed in designated facilities, subjected to medical inspections like livestock, and cycled through soldiers with industrial regularity. Some were told they'd be working in factories, others were simply taken. Most were from Korea, a Japanese colony where resistance meant death. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, these women existed in a legal and social limbo that victimized them twice. To the Japanese military, they were shameful evidence of crimes that needed eliminating. To many in their home countries, they were collaborators tainted by their victimization. To the Allied forces now occupying Japanese territories, they were an administrative problem without clear categorization. Were they prisoners, civilians, victims requiring aid, witnesses to war crimes? Captain James Hartford of the British Army's Civil Affairs Unit hadn't expected to deal with this. His job was supposed to be straightforward: process Japanese military prisoners, secure facilities, maintain order during the transition to Allied administration. When his unit liberated Singapore, they found the expected: Japanese soldiers waiting to surrender, abandoned equipment, civilians emerging from hiding. They also found the unexpected: military brothels that senior Japanese officers had failed to evacuate in their haste to surrender. Hartford was 34 years old, a solicitor from Manchester who'd been commissioned in 1940. He'd seen combat in North Africa, witnessed atrocities in Burma, and developed the professional detachment necessary to function in war. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for the women he found in the Orchard Road facility on August 15th. They were malnourished, showing signs of repeated physical trauma, and most disturbingly, completely passive, waiting for abuse with the dead-eyed acceptance of people for whom resistance had been systematically destroyed. The British military command's initial instinct was containment: isolate the women, record their testimony, prosecute Japanese officers responsible. Simple, clean, administratively manageable. What they hadn't anticipated was the depth of trauma that made even rescue a form of assault. The clash between protocol and humanity. The morning of August 18th, Hartford assembled his team for what he assumed would be a standard witness interview session. He had a translator, a Chinese Singaporean woman named Li Mei, who'd worked with British intelligence throughout the occupation. He had stenographers to record testimony. He had medical personnel to document injuries. He had everything except understanding of what he was actually facing. When the women were brought into the processing room, their behavior immediately unsettled him. They moved with mechanical obedience, forming a line without being told, standing at attention like soldiers. Several began removing their clothing unprompted. Hartford, horrified, immediately ordered them to stop and dress. The confusion in their faces, genuine incomprehension that a military man would refuse their bodies, was more disturbing than anything he'd witnessed in combat. Li Mei, the translator, explained in a shaking voice. Captain, they believe this is what you expect. This is what they've been conditioned to provide to military personnel. They don't understand that you don't want this. Hartford felt physically ill. The realization crashed over him. These women had been so thoroughly brutalized that they'd lost the ability to imagine interactions with military men that didn't involve sexual exploitation. Rescue itself, filtered through their experience, looked indistinguishable from their captivity. He made a decision that violated every protocol for prisoner interrogation. He left the room, ordered all male personnel to remain outside, and allowed only Li Mei and the 2 female nurses to continue. Even this caused panic. One woman, later identified as Subject 127, began crying uncontrollably, convinced that the removal of men meant execution was imminent. Japanese soldiers had told them that Allied forces would kill comfort women to eliminate witnesses. The nurses, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison and Corporal Jane Hughes, had served in field hospitals and seen terrible injuries. But treating women who flinched at every approach, who apologized for breathing, who seemed genuinely confused by medical care that didn't double as violation, required skills they hadn't been trained for. Morrison later wrote in her diary, "They're not treating us as rescuers. They're treating us as new owners. They don't understand they're free because they don't know what freedom looks like anymore." That afternoon, Hartford sent an urgent message to British Command. Require immediate expertise in trauma care. Standard POW protocols inadequate. Situation complex beyond military competence. Request civilian psychological specialists and female personnel support immediately. The first reversal, the moment of breakdown. Subject 127, whose real name was Kim Hai-won, though she wouldn't share it for another 3 weeks, had been taken from her village in Gyeonggi Province, Korea, in March 1942. She was 19 years old, had completed 6 years of education, and had been helping her family's small farm when Japanese officials arrived with promises of factory work in Singapore. The deception lasted until they were aboard the ship. The reality that followed was 3 years of systematic rape, beatings for resistance, forced medical examinations, and the complete destruction of her sense of self. When Captain Hartford ordered his men to leave the room, Hae-won assumed execution was imminent. Instead, Lieutenant Morrison approached slowly, hands visible, speaking through Li Mei in a voice that Hae-won initially couldn't process. "We're here to help you. No one will hurt you. You can keep your clothes on. We just want to make sure you're not injured and ask if you need anything. You can refuse to speak with us. You have rights now." The word rights was what broke her. Hae-won began crying, not quiet tears but convulsive sobbing that bent her double. She collapsed to the floor, and when Morrison instinctively moved to help her up, Hae-won scrambled backward in terror. The nurse stopped immediately, sat down on the floor herself several feet away and simply waited. For 15 minutes, Hae-won cried. Other women in the room watched with varying reactions. Some understood her breakdown. Others remained rigidly controlled, fearing that showing emotion would trigger punishment. Li Mei, translating while fighting her own tears, explained to Morrison, "She's crying because you're being kind. She's forgotten that humans can be kind. It's breaking something inside her." When Hae-won finally spoke, her first words were an apology. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for crying. I'm sorry for wasting your time. I'm sorry for being trouble." The reflexive apologies of someone conditioned to believe her existence was an imposition. Morrison responded through Li Mei with careful simplicity. "You don't need to apologize for being hurt. You don't need to apologize for crying. You don't need to apologize for existing. What was done to you was wrong. It wasn't your fault. Do you understand?" Hae-won looked at her with disbelief so profound it was almost philosophical. The possibility that her suffering wasn't deserved contradicted 3 years of reality. That contradiction would take months to resolve. Psychological reactions. The spectrum of survival. Over the following weeks, Hartford's unit processed 127 women recovered from various facilities across Singapore and southern Malaya. The psychological damage manifested in different patterns. Some women, like Hae-won, experienced delayed breakdowns when kindness contradicted their conditioned expectations. Others remained locked in mechanical compliance, unable to believe rescue was real. A few had constructed elaborate psychological defenses. Dissociation so complete they seemed to be observing themselves from outside their bodies. The most disturbing cases were women who'd convinced themselves they were willing participants, that they'd chosen this, that they had agency in their exploitation. This psychological survival mechanism, reframing powerlessness as choice to preserve some sense of self, made them defend their captors and resist rescue. One Japanese woman, Michiko, insisted repeatedly, "I wasn't forced. I volunteered to comfort our brave soldiers. This is honorable work." The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief in the face of obvious abuse was itself a form of trauma. Dr. Margaret Chen, a psychiatrist hastily brought from British India to assist, explained to Hartford, "What you're seeing is complex trauma. These women have been subjected to sustained abuse while completely powerless. The mind protects itself through various mechanisms: dissociation, compliance, reframing, emotional numbing. The problem is that these survival mechanisms which kept them alive now prevent them from accepting help. They can't trust rescue because trust was systematically destroyed." The British military, to its credit, adapted quickly. Standard POW interrogation protocols were abandoned entirely for the comfort women. Male personnel maintained strict distance unless specifically requested. Medical examinations were conducted only by female doctors with female translators present. Testimony was gathered slowly, voluntarily, without pressure. Women were housed separately from Japanese military prisoners and given freedom of movement within secured areas. But practical care couldn't address the deeper crisis. Most women had nowhere to go. Korean women feared returning to Korea, where societal shame often targeted victims rather than perpetrators. Chinese and Filipino women faced similar stigma in their home communities. Japanese women were technically enemy nationals in British-occupied territory. Many had been so thoroughly cut off from their families that reconnection seemed impossible. They were free, legally, but imprisoned by trauma and social abandonment. Hartford found himself wrestling with a question no military manual addressed. What do you do with victims whose victimization has made them socially dead, even as their bodies remain alive? In September 1945, a team of Allied war crimes investigators arrived in Singapore. Their mandate was clear: document Japanese atrocities, identify perpetrators, gather evidence for tribunals. The comfort women represented both critical testimony and political complication. The sexual violence they'd endured was systematic and widespread, clearly constituting war crimes under any reasonable interpretation. But prosecuting these crimes required victims willing to testify publicly, and every investigator quickly realized that was ethically and practically impossible. Major Robert Thornton, the lead investigator, met with Hartford and Dr. Chen to discuss the situation. His frustration was evident. "We have documented evidence of organized sexual slavery involving potentially hundreds of thousands of women. We have witness testimony, military records, physical facilities. By any standard, this is one of the most extensive war crimes of the conflict, but we can't prosecute it effectively because the victims are too traumatized to testify, and their home societies won't support them if they do." "Dr." Chen responded sharply, "You're asking women who've been raped systematically for years to stand in public courts and describe their rapes in detail while being cross-examined by defense lawyers who'll imply they were willing prostitutes. You're asking them to sacrifice what little psychological stability they've regained for the abstract principle of justice. Can you guarantee their safety, their social acceptance afterward, their futures?" Thornton couldn't, and he knew it. The political reality was even more complicated. The American occupation authorities in Japan were already prioritizing Japanese cooperation in containing communism over comprehensive war crimes prosecution. Korean comfort women were subjects of a former Japanese colony, making their legal status ambiguous. The British, Dutch, and Australian governments wanted to prosecute crimes against their own nationals, but showed less interest in Asian victims. Hartford observed this realpolitik with bitter clarity. The same women who'd been deemed expendable as victims were now deemed expendable as witnesses. Their suffering would be acknowledged in principle, but largely unprosecuted in practice, because their trauma made them legally inconvenient and their social status made them politically unimportant. He decided, without explicit authorization, to document everything anyway. Working with Li Mei and several women who volunteered testimony confidentially, he compiled detailed records: names, dates, locations, perpetrators, conditions, medical evidence. He marked the files, classified historical record, and sent copies to multiple archives, betting that even if justice was denied now, history would eventually demand accountability. October 1945. Lieutenant Morrison developed what would later be recognized as secondary traumatic stress. the psychological burden carried by those who witnessed trauma without being direct victims. She'd been caring for the comfort women for 2 months, hearing their stories, treating their injuries, watching them slowly begin to trust human contact again. The cumulative weight was crushing. One evening, Hartford found her crying in the medical supply room. She tried to compose herself, but the facade crumbled. "I can't stop thinking about them," she said. "I see their faces when I close my eyes. I hear their stories. One woman, Sue Jin, she's 18 years old. She was taken when she was 14. 14, James. 4 years of, I can't even say it. 4 years of systematic rape. And she apologizes to me when I bring her food. Apologizes for existing, for taking up space, for being trouble." Hartford had no comfort to offer because he felt the same weight. The moral enormity of what these women had endured, combined with the inadequacy of the help being provided, was exhausting in ways combat hadn't been. In combat, the enemy was clear and the objective straightforward. This was murkier, trying to heal damage so profound that healing itself seemed cruel, forcing women to feel again when numbness had been their only survival mechanism. Dr. Chen organized what she called support sessions for the care providers, opportunities to process their own emotional responses without judgment. "You can't help them if you're carrying unprocessed trauma yourselves," she explained. "Witnessing suffering is its own form of suffering. Acknowledge it, feel it, then use it to fuel better care, not burnout." Hei Wan, Subject 127, had begun speaking more freely with Morrison. She asked one day, through Li Mei, "Why do you cry for us? We're nothing. We're ruined. Why does our pain make you sad?" Morrison struggled to explain. Finally she said, "Because your pain is real. Because what happened to you was wrong. Because you're not nothing. You're human beings who deserved protection and got betrayal instead. If your suffering didn't make me sad, I'd be broken in a different way." Hei Wan considered this. Then, for the first time, she reached out and touched Morrison's hand voluntarily, a gesture of connection that took more courage than most people exercise in a lifetime. November 1945. The British administration faced a crisis. What to do with 127 women who legally should be repatriated but practically couldn't be? The Korean women faced particular challenges. Korea was now divided between Soviet and American occupation zones. The Soviet zone was politically hostile to British coordination. The American zone was theoretically accessible, but Korean society, traditional Confucian, deeply concerned with female purity, often treated comfort women as shameful rather than sympathetic. A Korean representative visited Singapore in October to facilitate repatriation. Pastor Kim, a Christian minister who'd survived Japanese occupation, spoke with the women through translators. His message, though well-intentioned, revealed the problem. "You can come home. The church will help you. But you must understand, you can never speak of what happened. You must live quietly, perhaps in remote areas. Marriage will be difficult. Society may not accept you, but Korea is still your home." The subtext was clear. Repatriation meant social death, just in a different location. Several women chose to return anyway, desperate to reconnect with families despite the cost. Others refused, preferring uncertain futures in Southeast Asia to certain ostracism in Korea. Hei Wan was among those who refused. The British government, struggling with post-war economic collapse and the approaching dissolution of their empire, wanted the women gone. Not from cruelty, but from bureaucratic necessity. They couldn't afford to support refugees indefinitely. But Hartford and his team advocated for an alternative. Allow the women to remain in Singapore or Malaya as residents, provide temporary support until they could establish livelihoods, and facilitate those who wanted to emigrate elsewhere. The compromise reached was inadequate but pragmatic. Women who wanted repatriation would be assisted. Those who refused could remain temporarily, but would need to become self-supporting. A small fund was established to help with education, job training, and basic needs. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Hei Wan, working with Li Mei, enrolled in English classes and nursing training. She discovered she had an aptitude for medical care, perhaps because understanding pain made her skilled at treating it. Other women found work in factories, shops, or domestic service. A few married locals, often men who themselves were outcasts. They built lives not from hope, but from stubborn refusal to let their trauma be the final word on their existence. December 1945. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tokyo Trials, convened with great ceremony, promising comprehensive prosecution of Japanese war crimes. Hartford received notice that several comfort women from his jurisdiction might be called as witnesses regarding systematic sexual violence. He was asked to identify women willing and capable of providing testimony. He consulted with Dr. Chen, who was blunt. Psychologically, very few are ready. Legally, their testimony would be credible. Practically, cross-examination would re-traumatize them. Socially, public testimony would destroy their chances of rebuilding their lives. You're asking me to recommend sacrificing these women for judicial accountability that might not even succeed. Hartford interviewed the women who'd developed enough trust to consider testifying. Haewon was among them. He explained carefully, "The tribunal wants to prosecute the officers who ran the comfort stations. Your testimony would be powerful evidence. But I need you to understand what you'd face. Public testimony in open court, detailed questioning about assaults, defense lawyers challenging your credibility, newspapers reporting your story globally. Your name would become permanently associated with your victimization." Haewon listened quietly, then asked, "Would it stop this from happening to other women?" Hartford wanted to say yes, but couldn't lie. "I don't know. Justice is important, but I can't guarantee it would prevent future crimes. What I can guarantee is that testifying would be painful, and your anonymity would be lost." Haewon considered for several days. Finally, she told Hartford through Lee May, "I will testify, but on conditions. I want my testimony recorded so history knows what happened, but I don't want to appear in person. I can't face the men who did this. I can't be in the same room as them. If my written testimony and deposition are enough, I'll do it. If they need me in court, I can't." Hartford submitted her written testimony and those of 3 other women to the tribunal. The prosecutors reviewed the evidence, consulted with judges, and ultimately decided not to pursue sexual violence charges comprehensively. The official reason was evidentiary complexity. The real reason was political expediency. The Allies were already concerned about Japanese cooperation in the emerging Cold War. Prosecuting widespread sexual slavery would be too embarrassing, too extensive, and too complicated. Hartford filed the testimonies anyway, classified, but preserved. Justice denied in 1945 might still matter in 2045. January 1946. Haewon completed her nursing training basics and received a position at the British Military Hospital in Singapore. It was entry-level, mostly cleaning and basic patient care, but it was employment with dignity. She moved into shared housing with 2 other former comfort women, Sue Jin, the 18-year-old Morrison had mentioned, and a Filipina woman named Maria. They formed a household based on shared trauma and mutual support. One evening, Hartford visited to deliver official documents, Haewon's resident permit, work authorization and identification papers that listed her simply as Kim Haewon, nursing assistant. The papers made no mention of her past. He'd fought bureaucracy for that small mercy. She could be defined by her present rather than her victimization. "These give you legal status to remain in Singapore," Hartford explained through Lee May, who'd become Haewon's friend beyond just translator. "You're free to move, work, live where you choose within British territories. If you ever want to try returning to Korea, we can assist. If you want to emigrate elsewhere, we can explore options. But you're no longer a prisoner, a victim under custody, or a ward of the military. You're a resident. You're free." Haewon held the papers carefully, as if they might dissolve. "Free," she repeated in English, one of the words she'd learned. Then in Korean through Lee May, "I don't know what free means anymore. For 3 years, freedom meant being left alone for a few hours. Now you say I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. But I don't know who I am if I'm not what they made me." Hartford understood. Freedom isn't just absence of constraint, it's presence of possibility. For someone whose possibilities had been systematically destroyed, freedom was terrifying because it demanded building an identity from ruins. "You're whoever you choose to become," Hartford said. "That's what freedom means. You were Kim Haewon before the war. You were Subject 127 during it. Now you get to decide who you are after. It doesn't erase what happened, but it means what happened doesn't have to be the only thing that defines you." Haewon nodded slowly. She'd begin the long, uncertain work of becoming someone she could live with. Not the person she'd been at 19, not the victim she'd been forced to become, but someone new built from the fragments. February 1946. Haewon was working in the hospital when a Japanese patient was admitted. a former lieutenant colonel being treated for tuberculosis before war crimes prosecution. Standard protocol kept him under guard, but medical necessity meant treatment. When Heiwan entered his ward, she froze. She recognized him. Colonel Tanaka Kenji had commanded the comfort station where Heiwan spent 8 months in 1943. He'd been administratively responsible for the system that processed, exploited, and discarded women with bureaucratic efficiency. He hadn't personally raped anyone. He was too senior, too refined for such direct involvement. But he'd organized the schedules, approved the medical inspections, signed the transfer orders, and maintained the paperwork that made systematic sexual slavery function smoothly. Now he lay in a hospital bed, gaunt from disease, awaiting trial for unrelated atrocities in Burma. He didn't recognize Heiwan. She'd been one of dozens of interchangeable women, and her weight gain and recovery had changed her appearance. But she recognized him with absolute clarity. She stood in the doorway, unable to move forward or retreat. Lieutenant Morrison noticed and approached quickly. "Are you all right? Do you need to leave?" Heiwan couldn't speak. Her training said care for the patient. Her trauma said flee. Her rage said something darker. Morrison understood immediately and reassigned her. But Heiwan stopped her. "No, I can do this. You don't have to. I know, but I want to. I need to show myself that he's just a sick old man, not the monster in my nightmares. I need to see him powerless." So Heiwan provided basic care, changing bedding, bringing water, monitoring symptoms. Tanaka was polite in the way of Japanese officers, thanking her with formal courtesy. He had no idea he was being cared for by one of his victims. The irony was almost philosophical. On the third day, as Heiwan adjusted his IV, Tanaka said in halting English, "You are kind, nurse. Thank you for caring for enemy soldier. Shows British mercy." Heiwan looked at him, this man who'd organized her torment, and felt something unexpected. Pity. He was dying, awaiting prosecution for crimes he'd probably rationalized as duty. He'd never understand what he'd done because understanding would destroy his self-concept as an honorable officer. She said nothing, finished her work, and left. The revenge she'd imagined, his suffering, his recognition, his apology, suddenly seemed irrelevant. He was already defeated. Caring for him without hatred was its own victory. March 1946. Dr. Chen organized a group session for women who'd remained in Singapore. It wasn't therapy in the clinical sense. That concept was barely developed for trauma care. It was simply space for women to talk, to hear each other, to realize they weren't alone in their damage and recovery. Heiwan attended reluctantly. She'd become functional, working, eating, sleeping without constant nightmares. But functional wasn't healed. In the group, women shared different pieces of their journeys. Su Jin talked about still flinching when men approached. Maria discussed her inability to feel pleasure without guilt. A Japanese woman named Yuki described her family's rejection when she tried to return home. Then Heiwan spoke, haltingly. "I cared for one of them, one of the officers from my station. He's dying, and I felt not happy, not satisfied, just tired. I wanted to feel rage, I wanted to feel justice, but I just felt tired. Does that mean I've forgiven him?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "Forgiveness is active, a choice to release anger. What you're feeling is different. Exhaustion with hatred. You've discovered that carrying rage takes energy you need for survival. That's not forgiveness. It's prioritization." Another woman, Minji, added, "I used to think I'd only be whole again when they paid for what they did, but they can't pay enough. No punishment is equal to what we endured. So if I wait for justice to feel whole, I'll wait forever. I have to find wholeness somewhere else." This was the revelation. Recovery wasn't about justice or revenge or even acknowledgement. It was about building lives worth living despite irreparable damage. The perpetrators might never face adequate punishment. Society might never fully acknowledge the crimes. History might forget or minimize. But the women in that room had a choice. Let their victimization be the defining fact of their existence, or build new definitions on top of old scars. Heiwan left the session with clarity she hadn't possessed before. She wouldn't forget. She wouldn't forgive. Forgiveness required something she couldn't give. But she would live deliberately and well, not because she'd overcome her trauma, but because living well was the only revenge available to her. Every day she woke up, worked, connected with others, felt human. That was victory. Small, unglamorous, but real. April 1946. Captain Hartford received orders transferring him back to Britain. His work in Singapore was complete. Other officers would manage ongoing operations. He'd been in Southeast Asia for nearly 3 years. He'd seen combat, liberation, reconstruction, and moral complexity that no amount of training had prepared him for. Before leaving, he met with the women who'd remained. Hai Wan was among them. Through Li Mei, he said, "I wanted to tell you that knowing you, witnessing your courage, has changed me. I came here thinking I understood right and wrong. You've taught me it's more complicated. You've taught me that mercy and justice aren't always the same thing, and sometimes the moral choice is unclear." Hai Wan looked at him carefully. "You showed us mercy we didn't ask for, that we couldn't even imagine. You treated us like humans when we'd been trained to think of ourselves as things. That mercy was—" She paused, searching for words, almost cruel, because it forced us to feel again. Numbness was easier. Feeling hurts. Hartford understood the paradox. Rescue had required forcing consciousness on people who'd survived through dissociation. Making them aware of their humanity meant making them aware of their violation. The mercy he'd offered had its own violence. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I don't know what else we could have done." "Nothing else," Hai Wan agreed. "This was the right choice. I'm just telling you it wasn't painless. Being saved hurt almost as much as being captive, just differently. You showed us we were worth saving, which meant confronting that we'd been treated as worthless. You can't rescue someone without forcing them to acknowledge what they were rescued from." This was the moral revelation Hartford would carry for the rest of his life. Doing the right thing isn't always kind, and kindness isn't always comfortable. The British forces had treated the comfort women with unprecedented mercy by military standards. But that mercy was a burden the women had to carry. The burden of being seen, of being human, of facing a future where they'd have to live with memory instead of dying with numbness. "What will you do now?" Hartford asked. "Live," Hai Wan said simply. "As well as I can. It's all that's left to do." Kim Hai Wan lived in Singapore until her death in 1993 at age 70. She worked as a nurse for 37 years, married a Chinese Singaporean merchant in 1952, raised 3 children, and never returned to Korea. She spoke publicly about her experience exactly once, in 1991, when Korean comfort women began breaking their silence and demanding Japanese acknowledgement. Her testimony, recorded in a Singapore hotel room, was measured and clear. "What was done to us was systematic sexual slavery. Call it what it was. Anything else is a lie designed to protect perpetrators." Captain James Hartford returned to Britain, resumed his law practice, and became a quiet advocate for war crimes prosecution. He testified at several tribunals about what he'd witnessed in Singapore. His testimony helped convict 3 officers, though the vast majority of comfort station administrators escaped prosecution. He maintained correspondence with several of the women for decades, including Hai Wan. His letters are preserved in the Imperial War Museum. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison became a psychiatrist specializing in trauma after the war. Her experiences in Singapore shaped her entire career. She published one of the earliest clinical papers on what would later be called complex PTSD, drawing on her observations of the comfort women without identifying them. She advocated for victims' rights and trauma-informed care until her death in 1989. The comfort women system remained largely unacknowledged for 50 years after the war. The women who survived faced social stigma, official indifference, and historical erasure. Japan's acknowledgement came reluctantly and incompletely. Compensation schemes were inadequate. Apologies were qualified. Many women died before receiving any recognition of their suffering. But silence eventually broke. Survivors began speaking. Historians began documenting. The story that military authorities in 1945 wanted to contain became, by the 1990s, a historical fact too massive to ignore. The mercy shown by officers like Hartford, refusing to exploit women already exploited, treating victims as humans rather than intelligent sources, documenting crimes even when prosecution failed, preserved evidence that later generations used for accountability. "The cruelest mercy is forcing someone to survive when death would be easier," Hai Wan wrote in her only published essay in 1992. "The British soldiers in Singapore showed us that mercy. They refused to let us die, physically or psychologically. They insisted we were worth saving even when we didn't believe it ourselves. That mercy was painful. It was also necessary." If this story makes you reflect on the complexity of rescue, on the burden of being forced to survive, share it. Because understanding the cost of trauma and the cost of healing from it means we might prevent it from being inflicted so systematically again. We remember not to feel good about remembering. We remember because forgetting would mean it could happen again.